One, two, one, two, one, two. Welcome everyone to Code Slice. This is Code Slice where we break down the code for Kivy. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at something very amazing. Yes, how to add and remove widgets. So I think within like making a lot of apps, knowing how to add and remove widgets is something which is very, very important. Whether it's maybe you wanting to add like a new contact, if you are, let's say, building like a messenger app, even with games, for instance, if an enemy, when you shoot an enemy and you kill the enemy, of course the enemy has to be removed. So, so removing and adding widgets, it's something very, very important. So here we're just going to look at the basics of removing and adding widgets using the Kivy language. So this is going to be how we can use the Kivy language. Yeah, so let's jump straight into it so that this video is not long. I already wrote the code, so I'll just explain what we have here. So on the right, you can see here, yeah, what we have. So we have 4 buttons and they're arranged in a grid layout. Yes. Yeah, that's pretty much all that we have actually. Yes. And something very, very important that you need to know regarding removing and adding widgets is that you must give the widget an ID. It's very important that you give the widget an ID that you want to remove. Otherwise, if you do not give it an ID, then you won't be able to remove it, because you need to basically mention which widget you want to remove. So if there's no ID, then basically there's no way of you giving a clear instruction towards which widget needs to be removed, or which widgets needs to be added. So I think we can start by looking at the how to add widgets. So of course, as I said, I do already have the code here. Yes, so we have a button which is called Add Buttons, and within this buttons, when you press it, it calls this function which is root add buttons. So if we go down here, we can see what this function does. So firstly, what it does is it creates a new button, right, with the text hello. So this is the text of it. Yes, so it creates a new button, but this new button is not added yet. So in order to add this button, we have to say where it needs to be added, right? So what we use to add widgets, we use add widget. We use add widget. So what you need to do first is you need to indicate where it needs to be added. So that is the first piece of the code before the add widget. So in this case, we want this button to be added within the grid layout, right? So that's why we are saying here, that's why we have here the IDs of the grid layout, as you can see. So this is the grid layout, so ID grid. Keep in mind that the ID, you can give it any name you want, but in this case, I chose grid ID so that it's easier to know what we're talking about. So firstly, what do we want to do? We want to add a widget where in self IDs grid, in the grid layout, basically, right? So add widget. And what is this widget that we want to add? In this case, it is the button here. So we can maybe say new button so that it's easier to understand. New button. All right. So if you go on and run this, right? If we run this, okay, so this is the button here. So if we press this button, it should add this button here in this grid layout, right? Okay, let's try it out. Oh, wow, as you can see, it's working. So you can add as many buttons as you want, basically. So whenever I press this button, it calls this function root.addButtons. And within that function, what it does is it creates a new button, right, with the text, which is hello. And then it takes and then in the grid layout, right, it adds the widget new button, which I defined here. That is what happens here. Yes, so that is how you add a button or a widget. So, okay, all right. So now how do we remove buttons? So how do we remove buttons? Actually, with removing buttons, it's also the same. It's just the opposite of adding. Yes. So in order for you to add a button, so I already have it written down here. So what do we have here? So on press, right? When we press the button, it's going to call this function, which is remove buttons. So here is the function here, remove buttons. Yes, remove buttons. So just like adding buttons, you need to firstly indicate where are these buttons that you want to remove, or where is this widget that you want to remove. So in this case, we want to remove a button, which is this one here. We want to remove this button, which is in the grid layout. So what we need to do is we need to then mention here the grid layout. So self IDS. So we can add here the grid layout. So we want to remove a widget in the grid layout, right? So we're indicating here, remove widget. What widget do we want to remove? We want to remove a button one. You see, this button, I gave it an ID so that I can be able to reference it and remove it. If you don't have an ID, then it will be very hard for you to remove a specific button. You need to have this ID to remove a specific button. So you see, so self.id button 1. So when I press this button now, it should be able to remove this widget. Let's check it out. Okay, let's run the code. Okay, so where is the button? Okay, so there's the add button, right? We used it before. Then there's the remove button now that we're working on. So when I press this button, it should remove this button here, because this is the button that is defined here. All right. Yeah, so let's go on and check this out. Wow, look at that. As you can see, it's gone. It's removed, right? It's removed. So that's how you remove and add buttons. Okay. Yes. So there are cases where maybe you want the button to remove itself. There are cases where you want to remove the button. Let's say you want the button to remove itself. So that's the last case that we're going to look at. But before we look into that, I just want to share something with everyone. Suppose maybe you don't want to remove like just one button, but maybe you want to remove the grid layout. Since all these buttons are within the grid layout, what will happen is that the grid layout, when you remove it, it's going to go with all the buttons that it contains, because all the buttons are defined within this grid layout. So if you remove this grid layout, then you will actually also remove all the buttons that are with it. So how do you remove a grid layout? So remember, as I mentioned, in order for you to remove a widget, first you need to define where that widget is, right? That you want to remove. So in this case, we want to remove the grid layout itself. So how do we do that? So usually we would define first, we would usually firstly define the, as you can see here, we would define where that widget is contained, right? So in this case, the grid layout is contained in this class, the screen class, right? The start screen, right? So how do we then remove this? So this class here, we refer to it as root in the Kivy language. We refer to it as root, right? We refer to it as root. Yeah, so which means, now let's just go on and remove this. So what we wanted to remove is we want to remove the grid layout which is in the root, right? So we can just say root, right? And then remove widget. Yes, in this case, what widget do we want to remove? So the widget that we want to remove is the grid layout. And where is this grid layout contained? It's contained within the root, right? So if you are defining a function here, you would use self, but in the Kivy language, you have to use root. So let's go on and define that. So it's going to be root, right? So in the root, what we want to remove, we want to remove the IDS, which is the grid. We want to remove the grid, right? Remember, you have to you have to reference the ID to remove a widget. Okay. All right. So when I press this button now, which is this one, it should remove all the buttons here because this grid layout is removed. Let's check it out. Okay, let's do it. Wow, look at that. Amazing. Amazing. So this becomes very, very, very important, when you're working with more advanced stuff. Hopefully you are working on advanced stuff, not just sticking to basics. Yeah, so that is how you you add and remove widgets. Now let's go on to the last part. How do we self-remove a button? Yeah, so how can you remove, let's say you have a button, right? And when you press the button, it removes itself. How do we do that? Actually, it's very, very simple. So once again, I have everything here. So what do we have here? So we have this button here, right? We have this button here. So what we want to do is we want to now remove this button when it presses itself, right? When we press it. So how do we do that? So firstly, we need to define where the button is that we're removing. So in this case, it's in the grid layout, right? Okay, so we can just say root, right? IDS, which is the grid ID. All right, so that's where it is. And then of course, sorry, I don't know why this pop-ups are appearing. Okay, then we can say remove, okay, widget. In this case, what widget do we want to remove? In this case, the widget we want to remove is this one here. We want to remove itself, right? So we can just say root dot IDS button 3, button 3. Okay, yeah, so when we press it, this button here, which is this button, will remove itself from the grid layout. Let's try it out. It's okay, so this is the button, self removal button. Wow, look at that. Look at that. Wow, let's also remove this button by pressing this one. Oh wait, I changed the code here. I forgot I changed the code. Yeah, so let's just, instead of removing the grid layout, let's just remove button 1. Okay, let's change that. We just want to make sure we add in style here. Okay, all right, so what do we do? Let's self remove this button. Bang, it's gone. All right, and let's remove this button here. Whoa, it's not going. What do we do wrong? Oh yes, remember you have to say where that button is. So I was removing this button, but I was saying that it's within the root, which is not true. Where is it? It's within the grid ID. Sorry, need to say IDS here. Okay, look at that. Now let's finally end in style. Okay, sorry, there's a bit of a noise here. All right, let's do it. Self remove, bang, it's gone. Please work this time. Okay, let's remove this one. Bang, it's gone. Look at that. Look at that. And finally, let's add buttons. Add, 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 add. Basically, you can add as many buttons as you want. Yep, this is Code Slice, everyone, and this is this is it for today. So please leave a comment in terms of what tutorials you'd like me to have. Yes, and also if you need any assistance, please do let me know. Please subscribe, comment, share. Goodbye.